Cameron Stewart is the Australian's chief international correspondent, and just like me, he was watching the opening addresses of the Bondi Royal Commission. Cam, it's going to be, of course, about the Bondi Beach massacre, in which 15 people died. Of course, somebody is up on charges in relation to that. Naveed Akram, one of the shooters. The other shooter, Sajid Akram, was shot dead at the scene. So there's a criminal process underway. How's the Royal Commission going to do its work with that in the background?
Well, that was explained to a degree as well, saying, look, they simply can't go, although the references to the Royal Commission are to look at the circumstances leading up to the shooting, including the intelligence and law enforcement response as well and what they knew, quite clearly because there are criminal proceedings afoot. Commissioner Bell said, look, there's some things we simply won't be able to talk about, certainly not in public. They suggested there would be quite a few private closed-door hearings in relation to that aspect of the Royal Commission. I think everyone understands that. Of course, the Royal Commission does have to be extremely careful not to prejudice those criminal charges against that surviving gunman. And so that's what she was saying. Look, we will be looking at this, but we will be looking at it with those constraints in mind.
Cam, Virginia Bell said she'd be using the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism. Now, for people who are unfamiliar with this is hot. Over the past couple of years, there's been great controversy about what anti-Semitism actually is and how it interacts or lives alongside freedom of speech and the right of people who believe that Israel has done the wrong things in its war in Gaza to express that opinion. Let's hear Virginia Bell reading aloud that International Holocaust Remembrance Association, IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism.
The definition itself is uncontroversial. It provides, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as a hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. The definition is accompanied by 11 examples of conduct which could amount to anti-Semitism. At least 2 of the examples are controversial and have led some critics to argue that the IHRA working definition wrongly labels as anti-Semitic the expression of political views which do not reflect a hatred of Jews.
Now, Virginia Bell didn't say exactly which examples she was talking about there, but I went and had a look at that IHRA definition, Cam, and I think this might be what she's talking about. The 11 examples listed by IHRA, things that are anti-Semitism, start with calling for, aiding or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of a radical ideology or an extremist view of religion. That one's pretty controversial. Another one that I think is uncontroversial is making mendacious, dehumanising, demonising or stereotypical allegations about Jews, and it goes on like that. But the ones that Virginia Bell identified are controversial, I would suggest are these. Example 10 is drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Example 7 is denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavour, or promoting myths about a world Jewish conspiracy, or Jews controlling the media, and so on. Cam, you've been at protests throughout the past couple of years about the war in Gaza. We have seen people saying those things in the streets of Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane since October 7, haven't we? That Israel is a Nazi state and that Jews control everything.
Look, that's right. Certainly the activist movement, the activist rump of the pro-Palestinian movement doesn't really even try to separate the politics of Israel with criticism of Jewish people in Australia. I mean, that's the unfortunate fact. That's what we've seen play out on the streets for over 2 years now. And, you know, that's obviously one of the root causes here of the tensions and the rise in anti-Semitism we've seen over the past 2.5 years. And I think what Commissioner Bell was saying today was, look, that she accepts there have been debates about that definition of anti-Semitism, but the fact is, Claire, that the Albanese government has accepted that definition. And what she's saying is we're not going to get bogged down in this Royal Commission having endless debates about this this sort of definition of anti-Semitism. We can't do that. We need to move on and look at the actual issue. She did make the point, though, which of course is a very correct point, that just mere criticism of the policies of the Israeli government does not constitute anti-Semitism. So she was very clear on that point, but she did say we're not going to get bogged down on definitions of anti-Semitism in this Royal Commission.
It's interesting, though, isn't it, Cam? By going there on day one in her opening address, she kind of has set this out as a battleground that is going to be addressed. I mean, I'm imagining that these public hearings are going to involve people wearing keffiyehs and people who are not, hashing it out in public, using this as an opportunity to kind of grandstand about exactly these issues from both sides. What do you think?
Yeah, look, that's right. Look, what she's interestingly done is she's made the point, which might seem a very obvious point to people if she's doing a Royal Commission on anti-Semitism, but she said that I am going to prioritise throughout this Royal Commission the focus on anti-Semitism. And what she then said was, I do accept, of course, that other religions experience intolerance and prejudice against them as well. However, as a starting point, we've had the massacre of people at Bondi. That's my starting point. We are going to focus on anti-Semitism. And I think that's an important point for her to make there, Claire, because certainly you've got a lot of claims by pro-Palestinian groups that Islamophobia in Australia is just as big a problem as anti-Semitism. And so I think she's sort of clearing the ground to say, look, we're going to focus on anti-Semitism first. And, you have 15 people who've been killed at Bondi. You have synagogues that have been burnt down, people harassed going to school, etc. I mean, it's quite clearly a bigger problem than Islamophobia. She didn't say all those in her words, but that's what she was meaning.
Yeah, let's just listen to a little snippet of that.
I'm mindful that while anti-Semitism may be the oldest religious and ethnic prejudice, other religions and ethnicities are also subject to prejudice in Australia. I expect that social cohesion will be advanced by measures that address discrimination against religious faiths, ethnicities and cultures generally. Nonetheless, against the background of the massacre of innocent people who appear to have been targeted simply because they were Jewish, I trust everyone will appreciate why the focus of this commission will be on tackling anti-Semitism as a starting point in strengthening our bonds of social cohesion.
Cam, I mean, she seems pretty optimistic there to me. I mean, I don't think that everyone who is going to be giving evidence at this Royal Commission is going to accept that anti-Semitism should or be or is the starting point. What do you think?
Look, I think it absolutely has to be the starting point because I think quite clearly that has been the main form of racial hatred we've seen in Australia for the last 2.5 years, and it's because led indirectly or directly, we don't exactly know until we know the full evidence, to the massacre at Bondi. So look, I think it's entirely correct that she takes that approach, but you're right, Claire, there will be a lot of people who will be debating this in the hearings, and I think this is one of the interesting things about this Royal Commission, because it goes into social cohesion as well as anti-Semitism. There's a lot of sort of subjective matters here, which will be the point of argument during the hearings. And I think there's going to be quite a few passions. There'll be people who are upset by what is unearthed at the hearings and what is said. And some of those people who actually opposed the Royal Commission originally said, look, listen, it will undermine social cohesion to have all these views expressed in public. But look, I think the contrary argument to that, and I think a better argument, is that, social cohesion was fraying and has been fraying in Australia anyway. You certainly can't get much more frayed than having 15 dead people at Bondi in a terror attack. And so these things need to be aired. But I think we're going to be up for some very emotional and passionate hearings in the months ahead.
Richard Lancaster SC, who's the counsel assisting the Royal Commission, went to this point about social cohesion. Let's just listen to what he had to say.
The letters patent refer to social cohesion as the national consensus in support of democracy, freedom and the rule of law. The consensus to which the letters patent refer is not a uniformity of opinion, nor does it require or involve the suppression of fair criticism and debate. It is quite the opposite in my submission. It is a consensus that a diverse multicultural society can subsist and thrive only by mutual acceptance of our respective democratic freedoms exercised according to law. Social cohesion begins with empathy. A large part of the work of this Commission will be to present evidence to allow a broader understanding of the scourge of anti-Semitism, its nature and prevalence throughout Australian society, and its impact on the lives of fellow Australians. Through that understanding, there may be opportunities to improve.
I think many people in the Jewish community, Cam, are hoping that what comes out of this Royal Commission is a criticism, essentially, of governments for allowing, for example, marches over the Harbour Bridge, marches in every city every weekend for 2 years, where critics of Israel loudly suggested that Israel was a terrorist state, Israel was a Nazi state, and so on. I just really wonder about Richard Lancaster's, again, I think quite optimistic idea there that just by existing and hearing evidence, the Royal Commission's going to convince everyone that anti-Semitism is real and that it's bad. What's your take on that?
Yes, I mean, social cohesion, of course, is slightly in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? I mean, it's not an absolute term. Everyone judges it in different ways. I think what Lancaster is saying is they want to investigate and try and redraw the line, if you like, between anti-Semitism and freedom of expression. I mean, for example, in tertiary institutions with those protests on campus, academics claimed academic freedom for saying what they were saying in their criticism of Israel, but often that strayed into anti-Semitism, and so that was used as a justification, if you like, for anti-Semitic comments. In the arts community, we've had a similar blurred line between so-called creative freedom and comments which border on anti-Semitism. It's really, we've had the Adelaide Writers' Festival controversy, for example. I think what the Royal Commission will seek to do, which is an almost impossible task, to be honest, is draw those lines in what they see as a reasonable and balanced way between freedom of expression and avoiding veering into anti-Semitism.
In that quite fevered moment where members of the Jewish community were lobbying Anthony Albanese to hold a royal commission, there were also suggestions for judges who could be the commissioner. One was Federal Court Justice Michael Lee, another was former High Court Chief Justice Robert French. They were people who members of the Jewish community thought would be fair to their point of view. There was some concern about Virginia Bell. Josh Frydenberg, the former federal treasurer, said that he had heard concerns about Virginia Bell from the Jewish community, although it was never quite identified exactly what those concerns would be. What was your sense on Tuesday of how Virginia Bell's going to be and how her conduct of this is going to go down with the Jewish community?
I think, those criticisms, I think, were puzzling because they were so vague. We never got to the heart of what the concerns were. And I think they were very counterproductive, frankly, for the Jewish community to have done. I mean, they'd finally got their wish to have the Royal Commission announced, and then they're complaining about the Commissioner. And I think that was just a step too far, and I think they regretted it fairly quickly, to be honest. I think they should be reassured by what Commissioner Bell said today. I think she made a point. Anti-Semitism will be the number one focus. She's not going to be debating a softening of the standards of anti-Semitism as far as the declaration of it goes. She's going to be practical and to get through as many of the terms of references as she can in the most comprehensive manner possible. I think she was pretty impressive today, and I think the Jewish community, at least from the small amount that we saw today, should take comfort in what we heard.
Cameron Stewart is the Australian's chief international correspondent. Thanks, Cam.
Pleasure.